The desert wind carried more than sand that day. It carried the sound of crying children that would change everything. In 1923, when the American Southwest was still wild and unforgiving, a single act of compassion would bridge two worlds and create a bond that defied every rule of a divided society. This is the true story of how one woman's kindness toward two abandoned children would summon an entire nation to her doorstep. Not for war, but for the most unexpected honor ceremony the frontier had ever witnessed. What started as a desperate rescue during a violent dust storm would become a legend that proved love knows no boundaries of race, culture, or time. The twins she found that day would grow up to become bridges between worlds, and their father's return would bring 200 Navajo warriors, not for revenge, but for something far more powerful: gratitude that would echo through generations. This is not just a story of survival, it's a testament to the human spirit's ability to find family in the most unexpected places and create hope where none existed before. The morning of June 15, 1923, began like any other in the small settlement of Cedar Springs, Arizona. Margaret O'Brien stepped onto her front porch, coffee cup in hand, and watched the sun paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber. At 32, she had spent 5 years in this remote outpost, serving as the local school teacher for the handful of families brave enough to call this harsh land home. Her husband James worked the general store, and together they had built a quiet life on the edge of civilization. The sky that morning held an ominous quality that made Margaret pause. Years of desert living had taught her to read the signs, and the unusual stillness in the air, combined with the strange copper color creeping across the horizon, suggested trouble was brewing. She had seen dust storms before, but something about this one felt different. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting. By noon, the wind had begun to pick up, carrying with it the fine desert sand that would soon become a choking wall of brown fury. Margaret hurried to secure the loose items around their property, bringing in the laundry and checking that the shutters were properly fastened. James had gone to the neighboring ranch to help with their preparations, leaving her alone to weather whatever the desert decided to throw at them. The storm hit with the force of a freight train just after 2 in the afternoon. Margaret had never experienced anything like it. The wind howled like a living thing, driving sand and debris against the walls of their small house with such violence that she feared the structure might not hold. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the world outside became a swirling nightmare of brown chaos. She huddled in the center of their main room, away from the windows, praying that James was safe wherever the storm had found him. It was during the worst of the storm, when the wind was screaming so loudly she could barely think, that she first heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the natural fury outside, a human sound, weak and desperate. At first, she convinced herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the wind creating phantom voices in its howling. But as she listened more carefully, straining her ears above the chaos, there was no mistaking what she was hearing. Children crying. Margaret's heart began to race. The sound was coming from somewhere near her front door, though in the blinding storm she couldn't see anything beyond a few feet. Every instinct told her to stay inside, to wait for the storm to pass before venturing out. The dust storm was deadly, capable of stripping the skin from exposed flesh and filling the lungs with choking sand. But the crying continued, growing weaker and more desperate with each passing moment. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, Margaret wrapped a thick blanket around her head and shoulders, covering her nose and mouth, and forced open the front door. The wind immediately tried to tear the blanket away, and sand pelted her like tiny bullets. She could barely keep her eyes open long enough to get her bearings, but she followed the sound of the crying voices, moving slowly and carefully across her front yard. The children were huddled against the side of her house, 2 small forms pressed together for protection against the elements. As Margaret approached, she could see they were very young, probably no more than 4 or 5 years old, and clearly of Native American descent. Their clothing was torn and inadequate for the harsh conditions, and their dark hair was matted with sand and dust. They looked up at her with eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, and Margaret's maternal instincts took over completely. She didn't stop to ask questions or wonder how they had come to be there. She simply scooped up both children, feeling how light and fragile they were in her arms, and carried them inside to safety. Once the door was securely closed behind them, she could finally get a proper look at what the storm had delivered to her doorstep. They were twins, a boy and a girl, identical in their delicate features and large dark eyes. Both were severely dehydrated and covered in scratches from their exposure to the elements. The girl seemed to be in slightly worse condition, barely conscious and burning with fever. The boy, though clearly exhausted, stayed protectively close to his sister, watching Margaret with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Margaret immediately set about caring for them, drawing on every maternal instinct she possessed despite never having had children of her own. She warmed water on the stove and began the careful process of cleaning the sand and dirt from their wounds. She found clean clothes that would fit them, shirts and pants that had been intended for the children of families who had moved away. Most importantly, she began the slow process of getting fluids into them, starting with small sips of water to avoid overwhelming their systems. As the storm continued to rage outside, Margaret found herself talking softly to the children in English, knowing they might not understand, but hoping the gentle tone of her voice would provide some comfort. The boy gradually began to relax, even attempting to help care for his sister, but the girl remained worryingly lethargic. Margaret had some basic medical training from her time helping the local families, but she knew the girl needed more help than she could provide. The storm lasted for almost 6 hours, one of the longest and most violent Margaret had ever experienced in her time in the desert. When it finally began to subside, she ventured to the window and looked out at a completely transformed landscape. Sand had drifted against buildings like snow, and debris was scattered everywhere. The world looked alien and hostile, and Margaret couldn't help but marvel at the fact that 2 small children had somehow survived in these conditions. When James finally returned home that evening, exhausted and covered in dust, he was stunned to find Margaret caring for 2 Native American children in their living room. His first reaction was one of concern for their safety and well-being, but it quickly became clear that there were larger questions that needed to be addressed. Where had these children come from? How had they ended up alone in a deadly dust storm? And most importantly, where were their parents? As they talked quietly while the children slept, wrapped in warm blankets on their sofa, Margaret told James about how she had found them. She described the crying she had heard over the wind, the desperate decision to venture outside, and the condition they had been in when she brought them in. James listened with growing amazement at his wife's courage and compassion, but also with increasing concern about what their presence might mean. The area around Cedar Springs was home to several Navajo communities, though relations between the native peoples and the white settlers were often strained. There had been incidents of violence and misunderstanding on both sides, and the arrival of 2 Navajo children under such mysterious circumstances was sure to raise questions and possibly tensions. James knew they needed to proceed carefully, both for the children's sake and for their own safety. That first night, Margaret barely slept, checking on the children regularly and worrying about the girls' continued fever. She had managed to get some broth into both of them, and the boy had even spoken a few words in what she assumed was Navajo, but the girl remained concerning. Margaret found herself praying more fervently than she had in years, asking for guidance on how to help these unexpected charges and for the strength to do what was right. When morning came, it brought with it a series of visitors. Word had spread quickly through the small community about the children Margaret had rescued, and people came by to see for themselves and offer what help they could. Some brought clothing and food, others brought advice and warnings about the complications of harboring native children. The local sheriff, a practical man named Tom Bradley, arrived before noon to assess the situation. Sheriff Bradley was a fair man who had worked hard to maintain peace between the various communities in his jurisdiction, but even he was puzzled by the circumstances. He questioned Margaret carefully about exactly how and where she had found the children, trying to piece together what might have happened. The twins were clearly too young to provide detailed information about how they had come to be alone, and their limited English made communication difficult. As they discussed the situation, it became clear that there were no easy answers. There had been no reports of missing Navajo children from any of the nearby settlements, and the storm had been so severe that it could have carried the twins for miles from wherever they had started. The boy had mentioned a word that might have been a name, but without more information, there was little to go on. Margaret found herself growing increasingly protective of the children as the day wore on. She could see the way some of the visitors looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and concern that made her uncomfortable. These were not curiosities to be gawked at. They were traumatized children who needed care and stability. When one of the women suggested that the children should be turned over to the Indian Agency, Margaret felt a fierce surge of protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. That evening, as the children slept more peacefully than they had the night before, Margaret and James had a serious conversation about their situation. They both knew that they couldn't simply keep the children indefinitely without making some effort to find their family. That they also felt a growing attachment to the twins and a responsibility for their well-being. Margaret had already begun to think of them as Maria and Michael, though she had no idea what their real names might be. The decision they reached that night would set the course for everything that followed. They would care for the children as long as necessary, while making every effort to find their family or community. They would provide them with food, shelter, medical care, and most importantly, love and stability until a better solution could be found. Margaret had already begun to imagine teaching them English and helping them navigate between the two worlds they would need to inhabit. Neither Margaret nor James could have imagined, as they made this commitment, that their simple act of compassion would eventually bring 200 Navajo warriors to their door, or that these two small children would become the bridge between worlds that would change their lives forever. All they knew was that the desert wind had brought them something precious, and they intended to protect it with everything they had. The first weeks with the twins tested Margaret and James in ways they had never anticipated. The children, whom they had tentatively named Maria and Michael until their real names could be discovered, were dealing with trauma that went far deeper than their physical injuries. Night terrors plagued both children, especially the girl, who would wake screaming in a language Margaret couldn't understand. The boy seemed to carry the weight of protecting his sister, never allowing himself to be separated from her for more than a few minutes at a time. Margaret's days became a careful routine of healing and discovery. She learned to read the subtle signs of the children's needs, understanding when they were hungry, or scared, or simply overwhelmed by their new surroundings. The language barrier proved to be both challenging and fascinating. The twins spoke primarily in Navajo, with only a few words of broken English between them. Margaret began to pick up basic Navajo phrases, starting with words for food, water, and comfort, while patiently teaching them more English vocabulary. Dr. Samuel Morrison, who served the scattered communities within 100 miles of Cedar Springs, made the long journey to examine the children during their second week with the O'Briens. He was an older man with graying hair and gentle hands, known for his fairness in treating patients regardless of their background. His examination revealed that both children were malnourished and showed signs of having lived rough for some time before the storm. The girl, in particular, had clearly been ill for several days before Margaret found them. What struck Dr. Morrison most was not the children's physical condition, which would improve with time and care, but their remarkable bond with each other and their growing attachment to Margaret. He watched as the boy carefully helped his sister drink her medicine and how both children's eyes followed Margaret around the room, seeking reassurance in her presence. In his professional opinion, these children had found exactly what they needed most: stability and unconditional care. Sheriff Bradley continued his investigation, sending messages to Indian agents and trading posts throughout the region, trying to trace where the twins might have come from. The responses trickled back slowly, and none provided clear answers. There had been a few families reported missing from various Navajo communities, but the descriptions didn't match, and the distances involved seemed impossible for such young children to have traveled on foot. It was during the third week that they made their first real breakthrough in communication. The boy, who had been gradually warming to James, suddenly pointed to himself and said clearly, "Yazzie." Then he pointed to his sister and repeated the word. Margaret realized he was telling them their surname, a common Navajo name she had heard before. It was a small piece of their identity, but it felt like a victory. Building on this success, Margaret began a more systematic approach to learning about the children. She drew pictures and used gestures to ask about their family, their home, and what had happened to them. Gradually, a fragmentary story emerged. There had been others with them, adults who were gone now. They had been traveling, being hungry and thirsty, hiding during the day and moving at night. The details were unclear, filtered through the limited vocabulary and traumatic memories of very young children. But the picture that emerged was one of a family in crisis. As the children's physical health improved and their English vocabulary expanded, their personalities began to emerge more clearly. The boy, Michael, proved to be intensely curious about everything in the O'Brien household. He followed James around the store, learning the names of objects and gradually understanding the concept of trade and commerce. He showed an aptitude for numbers that impressed both Margaret and James, and he seemed to have an intuitive understanding of fair exchange. The girl, Maria, was quieter but equally intelligent. She gravitated toward Margaret's books and seemed fascinated by the act of reading, even though she couldn't yet understand the words. Margaret began teaching her letters in simple words, using picture books intended for much younger children. Maria's ability to memorize and reproduce patterns was remarkable, and she seemed to absorb new concepts with startling speed. The children's presence in Cedar Springs gradually became less of a novelty and more of an accepted fact. Some of the initial suspicion from certain community members faded, as people saw how well-behaved and polite the twins were. Margaret made sure they attended the informal gatherings and community events, partly to help them integrate and partly to demonstrate that they belonged in the community just like any other children. It was at one of these gatherings that Margaret first learned about Thomas Begay, an elderly Navajo man who occasionally traded with some of the ranchers in the area. Mrs. Jest Henderson, who ran the boarding house, mentioned that he spoke excellent English and might be able to help communicate with the children more effectively. Margaret immediately asked Sheriff Bradley to try to locate him, hoping that he might provide the key to understanding the twins' story. Thomas Begay arrived on a hot afternoon in July, riding a sturdy pony and leading a pack horse loaded with hand-woven rugs and silver jewelry for trade. He was a dignified man in his 60s, with long grey hair and weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work. When Margaret brought the children out to meet him, his reaction was immediate and emotional. He spoke rapidly to them in Navajo, and both children responded with an enthusiasm Margaret had never seen before. The conversation that followed, translated by Thomas Begay, finally provided the answers they had been seeking. The children's real names were Kay, which was close to what Margaret had been calling Maria, and Hastian B.A., which they decided to continue calling Michael for simplicity. They were indeed twins, and they were from a Navajo community about 200 miles to the north. Their family had been traveling south to visit relatives when they had been caught up in a series of unfortunate events. Their father, a respected man named John Yazzie, had been accused of stealing cattle by a group of white ranchers. The accusation was false, but rather than face a trial that would almost certainly have gone against him regardless of the evidence, he had decided to take his family and leave the area. They had been traveling by night and hiding during the day, trying to reach the safety of relatives further south, when they had been surprised by a group of men who had been tracking them. In the chaos that followed, the family had been scattered. John Yazzie had fought to protect his wife and children, but in the darkness and confusion, the twins had become separated from their parents. They had wandered for days, surviving on berries and stream water, before the dust storm had caught them. The last they had seen of their parents, both were alive, but there had been no opportunity to reunite before the children became lost. Thomas Begay's face was grave as he related the story. He knew the area where the incident had occurred, and he knew the kind of men who were likely responsible. The fact that the children had survived at all was something of a miracle, but the chances of their parents having survived the encounter and the subsequent search were unclear. He promised to make inquiries within the Navajo communities to try to trace what had happened to John Yazzie and his wife. This information changed everything for Margaret and James. These children weren't simply abandoned. They were refugees from a violent encounter that had torn their family apart. The knowledge filled Margaret with both rage at the injustice and determination to provide these children with every opportunity they had lost. She also realized that their situation was more precarious than she had understood. If the same men who had scattered their family learned that the twins were in Cedar Springs, it could bring danger to everyone involved. Sheriff Bradley was equally concerned when he heard the full story. He knew some of the ranchers in the area where the incident had supposedly occurred, and while he hoped they weren't involved in anything illegal, he also knew that accusations of cattle theft were often used as pretexts for violence against Native people. He advised the O'Briens to be cautious about who they trusted with information about the children's background. As the summer progressed, Kay and Michael continued to flourish under Margaret's care. They learned English rapidly, and their health improved dramatically with regular meals and medical attention. Margaret began formal lessons with them, teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic alongside basic lessons about American culture and society. She also encouraged Thomas Begay to continue visiting, to ensure that they maintained their connection to Navajo language and traditions. The children spoke of their parents constantly, always with the assumption that they would be reunited eventually. Margaret found these conversations heartbreaking, particularly as Thomas Begay's inquiries continued to yield no information about John Yazzie or his wife. The various Navajo communities had heard rumors about the incident, but no one had seen the parents since the night the family was scattered. As autumn approached, Margaret realized that she and James were facing a decision they hadn't anticipated when they first took in the children. The initial plan had been to care for them temporarily until their family could be located, but as the months passed with no word of their parents, it was becoming clear that temporary care was becoming something much more permanent. The children had settled into their lives in Cedar Springs, thrived under their care, and begun to think of the O'Brien house as home. The question of what would be best for Kay and Michael became increasingly complex. Margaret knew that the ideal situation would be for them to be reunited with their parents or placed with Navajo relatives who could maintain their cultural connections. But she also knew that they were flourishing in their current environment, receiving an education and opportunities that might not be available elsewhere. Most importantly, she could not ignore the deep emotional bonds that had formed between herself and the children. James was equally conflicted. He had grown to love the twins as if they were his own children. Marveling at their intelligence and resilience, Michael had become his constant companion around the store, showing an aptitude for business and a natural charm that made customers smile. Kay had brought out a tenderness in Margaret that he had never seen before, and the house felt alive in a way it never had when it was just the two of them. The decision about the children's future was complicated by the broader social and political context of the time. Relations between white settlers and Native American communities remained tense throughout the Southwest. The government's Indian policies were inconsistent and often harmful, and there were few legal protections for Native children separated from their families. Margaret and James knew that if they involved official authorities, the children might be sent to a government boarding school designed to eliminate their Native identity, or placed in situations that would be far worse than their current circumstances. As winter approached, Margaret made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. She would continue caring for Care and Michael as her own children, while never giving up hope of reuniting them with their family. She would ensure they received the best education possible while also maintaining their connection to their Navajo heritage through Thomas Begay and other Native contacts. Most importantly, she would love them unconditionally and provide them with the stability and security they needed to heal from their trauma. The children seemed to sense this commitment, and their behavior reflected their growing sense of security. Kay began to call Margaret Shima Sani, which Thomas Begay explained meant mother in a respectful and affectionate way. Michael started helping with household chores without being asked, and took pride in explaining to visitors how various items in the store worked. Both children began to exhibit the confidence and curiosity that suggested they were finally beginning to heal from their traumatic experiences. As 1923 drew to a close, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that dust storm in June. What had begun as a simple act of compassion during a natural disaster had evolved into something much more profound. She and James had become parents to two remarkable children who had enriched their lives beyond measure. But even as she celebrated their progress and the love that had grown between them, Margaret never stopped wondering about John Yazzie and his wife, and whether somewhere in the vast Southwest, two parents were still searching for their lost children. The winter of 1923 brought both challenges and unexpected joys to the O'Brien household. Care and Michael had been with them for 6 months now, and what had begun as emergency care had transformed into something that felt increasingly like a permanent family arrangement. The children had not only adapted to their new life, but were thriving in ways that amazed everyone who knew them. Margaret established a comprehensive education routine that went far beyond basic literacy and arithmetic. She had written to her former colleagues from her teacher training in Phoenix, requesting advanced materials and guidance on educating gifted children. Both Kay and Michael showed remarkable intellectual abilities that seemed to flourish with proper attention and challenging material. Kay, in particular, demonstrated an extraordinary memory and ability to analyze complex concepts that impressed even Thomas Begay, who visited monthly to help maintain their connection to Navajo culture. The language situation in their household had become fascinatingly complex. The children were now fluent in English, speaking with only the slightest accent that Margaret found charming. However, they maintained their Navajo fluency through their regular sessions with Thomas Begay and through speaking to each other in their native language when they thought they were unobserved. Margaret had also picked up enough Navajo to understand basic conversations and could even participate in simple discussions about daily activities. Michael showed an entrepreneurial spirit that both amazed and concerned James. The boy had an intuitive understanding of value and exchange that went far beyond his years. He began proposing improvements to the store's organization and even suggested new products that might appeal to the diverse community they served. When a group of Navajo traders came through town, Michael served as an unofficial translator and intermediary, helping to negotiate deals that satisfied everyone involved. James realized he was watching a natural businessman develop, someone who could succeed in either the white or Native communities. Kay's talents lay in different areas but were equally remarkable. Her artistic abilities became apparent when Margaret introduced her to drawing and painting as part of her education. The girl could reproduce complex patterns from memory and began creating original designs that combined traditional Navajo motifs with techniques she was learning from art books Margaret had ordered. She also showed an unusual ability to understand and explain complex ideas to others, often helping her brother when he struggled with his studies. The social dynamics of Cedar Springs continued to evolve around the children's presence. Most of the community had fully accepted them, and several families had begun asking Margaret for advice on educating their own children, impressed by the twins' obvious intelligence and good behavior. However, there were still undercurrents of tension from a few individuals who remained uncomfortable with the arrangement. Margaret learned to navigate these carefully, maintaining cordial relationships while making it clear that any criticism of the children was unwelcome. Dr. Morrison had become a regular visitor, ostensibly to check on the children's health, but increasingly because he was fascinated by their development and resilience. His medical reports documented not only their excellent physical health, but also their remarkable psychological recovery from the trauma they had experienced. He began using their case as an example in his correspondence with colleagues about the importance of stable, loving care in helping children overcome difficult circumstances. Thomas Begay's visits had become some of the most anticipated events in their household routine. The elderly Navajo man had developed a deep affection for the children and took his role as their cultural teacher seriously. He brought stories, songs, and traditional crafts, ensuring that Kay and Michael understood their heritage and could take pride in their identity. He also continued his inquiries about their parents, though each month brought the same disappointing lack of news. During one particularly meaningful visit in the spring of 1924, Thomas Begay brought with him a young Navajo woman named Mary Begay, his niece, who had been educated at a boarding school but had maintained strong ties to her culture. Mary was impressed by the children's bilingual abilities and their apparent comfort moving between two worlds. She spent several days with the family, helping Margaret understand more about Navajo child-rearing practices and cultural expectations. Mary's visit led to an important conversation about the children's future. She explained that in traditional Navajo culture, children belonged not just to their immediate family, but to their extended clan and community. The fact that Kay and Michael had been separated from their people was a serious cultural disruption that would need to be addressed eventually. However, she also acknowledged that Margaret and James had provided exceptional care and that the children were receiving opportunities that might not have been available in their original community. This conversation prompted Margaret to think more seriously about the long-term implications of their arrangement. She realized that as the children grew older, questions about their identity and belonging would become more complex. She began researching ways to formally adopt them, while also exploring options for maintaining strong connections to Navajo communities. The legal landscape was complicated, with different rules applying to Native children, and Margaret wanted to ensure that whatever decisions were made would truly serve the children's best interests. The summer of 1924 brought an unexpected development that would prove crucial to their story. A traveling photographer named William Curtis, who was documenting life in the American Southwest, stopped in Cedar Springs for supplies and heard about the remarkable family situation at the O'Brien house. Curtis was immediately intrigued by the story and asked permission to photograph the children and interview the family about their experiences. Margaret was initially hesitant, worried about privacy and the potential for unwanted attention, but James convinced her that sharing their story might help other families in similar situations. The photographs Curtis took captured the children's intelligence and happiness, showing them reading, working in the store, and playing with obvious contentment. His written account described Margaret and James's dedication and the remarkable way the children had flourished under their care. When Curtis's article appeared in several national magazines later that year, it attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Margaret began receiving letters from educators, social workers, and other families who had dealt with similar situations. Some offered advice and support, others shared their own stories, and a few presented opportunities that Margaret had never considered. One letter in particular caught her attention. It came from a woman named Dr. Fall. Elizabeth Harrison, who ran a progressive school in Santa Fe that specifically sought to bridge cultural divides and provide advanced education for exceptional children from diverse backgrounds.
Doctor.
Harrison had read Curtis's article and was interested in meeting Kay and Michael, believing they might thrive in an environment designed for children navigating multiple cultural identities. The prospect of the children leaving for school filled Margaret with conflicted emotions. She wanted them to have every possible opportunity, but the thought of their absence left her feeling empty. However, when she discussed the possibility with Kay and Michael, their reactions surprised her. Both children were excited about the prospect of advanced education, but insisted that Cedar Springs would always be their home and that Margaret and James would always be their parents. As autumn approached, Thomas Begay made what he announced would be a particularly important visit. He arrived with more ceremony than usual, bringing with him gifts of silver jewelry and hand-woven textiles. After the usual greetings and catching up, he asked to speak privately with Margaret and James. His expression was serious in a way they had never seen before. What Thomas Begay had to tell them would change everything they thought they knew about the children's story. Through his persistent inquiries and connections throughout the Navajo community, he had finally learned the fate of John Yazzie and his wife. The news was both better and more complicated than anyone had anticipated. John Yazzie was alive. He had survived the encounter that had scattered his family, though he had been wounded and had spent months recovering. His wife had also survived but had been severely injured and required extensive healing. Both parents had spent the past year desperately searching for their children, following every lead and rumor, never giving up hope but growing increasingly desperate as time passed without success. Thomas Begay explained that John Yazzie had become something of a legendary figure within the Navajo communities during his search for his children. His determination and refusal to accept their loss had inspired others, and his story had spread throughout the region. Several prominent Navajo leaders had joined his cause, and there was growing momentum within the community to support his search through whatever means necessary. The reason Thomas Begay looked so serious as he related this information became clear as he continued his story. John Yazzie had recently learned through the network of traders and travelers that his children were living with a white family in Cedar Springs. His initial reaction had been one of immense relief and gratitude, but this had quickly been complicated by more complex emotions and considerations. While John Yazzie was grateful that his children were alive and apparently being cared for well, he was also struggling with questions about cultural identity and belonging. He had heard that the children were now speaking English fluently and living as white children, and he worried about what this might mean for their connection to their heritage and their place within the Navajo community. These concerns were shared by other tribal members who felt that the children needed to be returned to their people to prevent the loss of their cultural identity. Thomas Begay explained that John Yazzie was facing pressure from different factions within his community. Some urged him to simply take his children back, arguing that they belonged with their real family regardless of the circumstances. Others suggested a more diplomatic approach, recognizing the care the children had received and the bonds that had formed. Still others proposed a compromise that would allow the children to maintain connections to both families while ensuring their Navajo identity remained strong. Margaret listened to this explanation with a mixture of joy and terror. Joy that the children's parents were alive and that the family could potentially be reunited, but terror at the prospect of losing Kay and Michael, who had become the center of her world. She also felt a growing anxiety about the political and cultural implications of the situation, realizing that their private family arrangement had become entangled in larger questions about identity, belonging, and cultural preservation. James asked the question that was foremost in both their minds. What did John Yazzie want to do about the situation? Thomas Begay's answer revealed the wisdom and complexity of a man who had spent a year searching for his children while also learning about the world they now inhabited. John Yazzie wanted to meet with Margaret and James to discuss the situation directly. He wanted to see his children and assess their condition and happiness for himself. Most importantly, he wanted to understand the people who had cared for his children and to determine what arrangement would truly serve Kay and Michael's best interests. He was not interested in simply taking them away if doing so would harm them, but he was also not prepared to abandon his parental rights and responsibilities. The meeting that Thomas Begay was proposing would be unprecedented in the region. It would require John Yazzie to travel to Cedar Springs, a white settlement where he might face hostility or danger. It would also require Margaret and James to confront the possibility that their time with the children might be coming to an end. But all parties agreed that the children's welfare had to be the primary consideration, and that required honest communication between all the adults involved. As Thomas Begay prepared to leave to arrange this meeting, Margaret realized that everything was about to change once again. The quiet life they had built with Kay and Michael was about to be tested in ways she couldn't predict, but she also knew that this confrontation was necessary and overdue. The children deserved to know their father, and John Yazzie deserved to know what had become of the children he had never stopped searching for. That evening, as Margaret helped Kay with her reading and listened to Michael practice the English speech he was preparing for a community gathering, she wondered how to prepare the children for what was coming. They had never stopped talking about their parents, but their memories had become somewhat abstract after more than a year. The prospect of seeing their father again would undoubtedly be overwhelming, and Margaret wasn't sure how it would affect the stability they had worked so hard to build. The weeks leading up to John Yazzie's visit were filled with a tension that permeated every aspect of daily life in the O'Brien household. Margaret found herself watching Kay and Michael with new intensity, memorizing their expressions and mannerisms, treasuring every moment, while preparing herself for the possibility that these might be their final weeks together. The children seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, though they didn't fully understand its source. Margaret decided that honesty was the best approach when it came to preparing the children for their father's visit. She sat them down one evening after dinner and explained, with Thomas Begay translating the more complex concepts, that their father was alive and wanted to see them. The children's reactions were immediate and intense. Kay began crying with joy and relief, while Michael became very quiet and serious, asking detailed questions about where their father had been and why it had taken so long for him to find them. The preparation for John Yazzy's visit became a community effort. Sheriff Bradley worked with Thomas Begay to ensure that the meeting would take place safely and without interference from anyone who might object to a Navajo man visiting the white settlement. Dr. Morrison offered his services in case medical attention was needed, and several of the more progressive families in town expressed their support for the reunion. Margaret threw herself into preparations with characteristic thoroughness. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, prepared special foods, and gathered together examples of the children's schoolwork and artistic achievements to show their father. She wanted John Yazzie to see immediately that his children had been cherished and had thrived under her care. At the same time, she worked with Thomas Begay to learn proper Navajo protocols for greeting and showing respect to an elder and father. James was dealing with his own complex emotions as the visit approached. He had grown to love Kay and Michael as deeply as if they were his biological children, and the prospect of losing them was almost unbearable. At the same time, he felt a genuine desire to meet the man who had created these remarkable children and who had never given up searching for them. He spent long hours talking with Sheriff Bradley and Dr. Morrison, trying to understand what role he might play in whatever arrangement emerged from the meeting. The children's behavior in the days leading up to their father's arrival was a fascinating study in psychological complexity. They were excited and happy about the prospect of seeing him, spending hours discussing their memories of their parents and speculating about what their father might look like now. At the same time, they showed signs of anxiety about how their two worlds would fit together. Kay asked repeatedly whether Margaret would still be her mother after her father came, while Michael worried about whether his father would approve of his English education and his work in the store. Thomas Begay served as an invaluable intermediary during this period, helping both families prepare for what promised to be an emotionally charged encounter. He explained to Margaret and James that John Yazzie was a traditionalist in many ways, but also a pragmatist who understood that the world was changing and that his children had been changed by their experiences. He had spent the past year not only searching for his children but also learning about the white world they had entered, trying to understand what their new life might mean for their future. On the morning of September 15, 1924, John Yazzie arrived in Cedar Springs. He came not alone, but accompanied by a small group of Navajo men who served as both companions and witnesses to what was clearly seen as a significant event within their community. Margaret watched from her window as the group rode slowly down the main street of the settlement, noting the dignity and gravity of their bearing. John Yazzie himself was immediately recognizable as the children's father, sharing their delicate features and intelligent eyes, though his face was marked by the hardships of the past year. The initial meeting took place in the O'Brien's front parlor, with Thomas Begay serving as translator and mediator. Margaret had worried about how Kay and Michael would react to seeing their father after so many months, but their response was immediate and natural. Both children ran to him without hesitation, and John Yazzie gathered them into his arms with tears streaming down his face. The reunion was deeply moving, and even the typically stoic Navajo men who had accompanied him showed visible emotion. For the first hour, Margaret and James simply observed while John Yazzie reacquainted himself with his children. He spoke to them rapidly in Navajo, asking questions about their health, their experiences, and their feelings. The children responded with equal enthusiasm, obviously comfortable communicating in their native language and eager to share everything that had happened to them. Margaret felt a complex mixture of joy at witnessing their happiness and sadness at being excluded from this intimate conversation. When John Yazzie finally turned his attention to Margaret and James, his demeanor was formal but respectful. Through Thomas Begay, he expressed his profound gratitude for their care of his children and acknowledged that they appeared to be healthy and happy. He asked detailed questions about their education, their daily routine, and their integration into the community. Margaret found herself being interviewed by a father who was both grateful and protective, someone who was trying to understand every aspect of his children's new life. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. John Yazzie was clearly an intelligent and thoughtful man who understood the complexities of the situation far better than she had anticipated. He explained his perspective on what had happened to his family and his gratitude that his children had found safety and care when they needed it most. At the same time, he made it clear that he had never stopped being their father and that he intended to reclaim his role in their lives. What surprised Margaret most was John Yazzie understanding of the benefits his children had gained from their time in the white community. He had clearly thought deeply about their education and the opportunities that might be available to them if they could successfully navigate both worlds. Rather than simply demanding their return, he wanted to discuss arrangements that would serve their long-term interests while also maintaining their cultural identity and family connections. The discussion continued for several hours, with breaks for meals and opportunities for the children to spend time with both their birth father and their adoptive parents. Margaret was struck by how naturally Kay and Michael seemed to move between the two relationships, showing affection and respect for all the adults involved, without apparent conflict or confusion. As the day progressed, a remarkable negotiation began to take shape. John Yazzie proposed an arrangement that would allow the children to continue living with Margaret and James during the school year while spending summers with him and his wife, who was recovering from her injuries in a Navajo community about 200 miles north. This would ensure their continued education and development, while also maintaining their connection to their heritage and family. Margaret's initial reaction was one of relief and gratitude that she wouldn't lose the children entirely. But as the discussion continued, she realized the proposal was more complex than it initially seemed. John Yazzie was essentially asking her and James to become partners in raising his children, a relationship that would require ongoing communication, cooperation, and mutual respect. It would also require the children to become comfortable moving between two very different worlds on a regular basis. The children themselves were consulted about the proposed arrangement, and their response was enthusiastic. Kay and Michael seemed to understand instinctively that they didn't have to choose between their two families, that they could maintain loving relationships with all the adults who cared for them. Their maturity and adaptability in handling this complex situation impressed all the adults involved. However, the arrangement also required addressing some practical and legal challenges. Sheriff Bradley raised questions about guardianship and legal authority, particularly given the complicated legal status of Native American children at the time. Dr. Morrison offered to provide documentation of the children's health and development to support whatever legal arrangements were necessary. Thomas Begay volunteered to serve as an ongoing intermediary to help navigate any cultural or communication issues that arose. As evening approached, John Yazzie and his companions prepared to return to their own community, but not before establishing concrete plans for the ongoing arrangement. It was decided that Kay and Michael would remain with Margaret and James until the end of the school year, at which point they would travel north to spend the summer with their birth family. Regular communication would be maintained through Thomas Begay, who would visit monthly to provide updates and address any concerns. The farewell between John Yazzie and his children was emotional but not devastating. The children clearly understood that this was not another separation like the one they had experienced during the dust storm, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. They were excited about the prospect of seeing their mother again and meeting relatives they had never known, while also being reassured that Margaret and James would remain important parts of their lives. Margaret found herself deeply moved by John Yazzie's final words to her before he left. Through Thomas Begay, he told her that she had become a true mother to his children, not by replacing their birth family but by providing them with love and opportunities when they needed them most. He said that in the Navajo tradition, children could have many parents, and that extended family relationships were considered blessings rather than complications. After the visitors had departed, Margaret and James spent the evening talking with Kay and Michael about their feelings and expectations regarding the new arrangement. Both children were excited and optimistic, viewing the situation as an adventure rather than a problem to be solved. Their resilience and adaptability continued to amaze the adults who cared for them. That night, as Margaret lay awake thinking about the day's events, she realized that her family had not been diminished by John Yazzie's return, but had actually been expanded. She would now be connected not only to Kay and Michael, but to their birth family and their broader Navajo community. The arrangement would require adjustments and compromises, but it offered opportunities for growth and understanding that she had never imagined. The weeks following John Yazzie's visit were filled with planning and preparation for the new arrangement. Margaret began corresponding with Mary Begay, who would serve as a liaison with the children's birth family. She also started learning more about Navajo culture and customs, wanting to be able to support the children's cultural education even when they were living in Cedar Springs. The community's reaction to the arrangement was generally positive, though there were some individuals who questioned the wisdom of allowing the children to maintain connections to both worlds. Margaret found herself becoming an advocate not only for Kay and Michael, but for the broader principle that children could successfully navigate multiple cultural identities if given proper support and understanding. As the school year progressed, it became clear that the arrangement was working well for all involved. The children continued to excel academically and socially, while also preparing for their summer with their birth family. They began teaching Margaret and James basic Navajo words and customs, excited about the prospect of their adoptive parents understanding more about their heritage. The success of their unique family arrangement was beginning to attract attention from beyond Cedar Springs. Other families dealing with similar situations began reaching out for advice, and several educators and social workers expressed interest in studying their model as a potential approach for other intercultural adoption situations. Margaret found herself reluctantly becoming a spokesperson for progressive approaches to child welfare and cultural preservation. The spring of 1925 brought news that would transform the O'Brien family's private arrangement into a public celebration that would be remembered for generations. Thomas Begay arrived for his monthly visit with an unusual sense of excitement and ceremony that immediately captured everyone's attention. He had traveled not alone this time, but with 2 other Navajo elders, and they came bearing official messages from the tribal council. What Thomas Begay had to announce was beyond anything Margaret and James could have imagined. Word of their care for Kay and Michael, and the successful arrangement that had been worked out with John Yazzie, had spread throughout the Navajo communities of the Southwest. The story had been told and retold, growing in significance with each telling, until it had become something of a legend about the possibility of understanding and cooperation between different peoples. The tribal council had made a unanimous decision to formally honor Margaret and James for their care of the children. This was not simply a gesture of gratitude, but a profound cultural event that would officially recognize them as family members within the Navajo community. The honor being proposed was unprecedented in the history of the tribe, as it would be the first time that non-Navajo individuals were formally adopted into the tribal family structure. Thomas Begay explained that the ceremony being planned would bring together representatives from Navajo communities across a vast area of the Southwest. Chiefs, elders, and respected members from dozens of different groups had committed to attending, creating a gathering larger than any seen in the region for many years. The estimated number of participants had reached 200, including warriors, elders, women, and children, all coming to witness and participate in this historic event. Margaret's first reaction was one of overwhelming humility and concern. She had never sought public recognition for caring for Kay and Michael, and the thought of being the center of such a large gathering was intimidating. She worried about whether she and James were worthy of such honor, and whether they truly understood the significance of what was being offered to them. James shared her concerns, feeling unprepared for the responsibility and visibility that would come with formal adoption into the Navajo community. Kay and Michael, however, were absolutely thrilled by the news. For them, the prospect of their 2 families coming together in celebration represented the perfect resolution to their complex identity questions. They began immediately planning what they would wear, what they would say, and how they would introduce their various family members to each other. Their excitement was infectious and helped Margaret and James overcome their initial anxiety about the event. The preparations for the ceremony required months of coordination and planning. The event would take place in Cedar Springs, transforming the small settlement into the site of the largest intercultural gathering in the region's history. Sheriff Bradley worked with Thomas Begay and other tribal representatives to ensure that the logistics could be handled safely and that there would be no interference from anyone opposed to such a celebration. The date was set for June 15, 1925, exactly 2 years after Margaret had found K.A. and Michael in the dust storm. The symbolism was intentional, marking not just the anniversary of their rescue, but the completion of their journey from trauma and separation to healing and belonging. The ceremony would take place over 3 days, with different elements planned for each day to accommodate the various groups traveling to attend. Word of the upcoming ceremony spread far beyond the immediate communities involved. Newspapers in Phoenix, Albuquerque, and even Denver picked up the story, describing it as a remarkable example of intercultural cooperation and understanding. Reporters and photographers began arriving in Cedar Springs weeks before the event, eager to document what many were calling a historic moment in relations between white settlers and Native Americans. Margaret found herself thrust into a public role she had never anticipated or wanted. Reporters asked her detailed questions about her motivations for caring for the children, her feelings about Navajo culture, and her thoughts on the broader implications of their story. She tried to deflect attention from herself and focus on Kay and Michael, emphasizing that any recognition should go to them for their resilience and adaptability. The children themselves handled the media attention with remarkable poise and intelligence. Kay, now 12 years old, spoke eloquently about her experiences living in two cultures and her gratitude for all the adults who had cared for her. Michael, equally articulate, impressed reporters with his understanding of both business and traditional Navajo values. Their interviews provided compelling evidence of the success of their bicultural upbringing. As June 15th approached, Cedar Springs was transformed into a bustling center of activity. Navajo families began arriving days early, setting up traditional dwellings around the settlement, and bringing with them horses, cattle, and all the supplies needed for the extended celebration. The local businesses struggled to accommodate the sudden influx of visitors, and several temporary structures were erected to provide additional space for meetings and activities. Margaret and James spent the final days before the ceremony learning about the protocols and expectations for their participation. Thomas Begay and other cultural advisors taught them about the significance of various elements of the ceremony, the appropriate responses to different rituals, and the meaning of the gifts they would be receiving. They also learned basic Navajo phrases that they would need for their formal adoption into the tribal family structure. On the morning of June 15th, Margaret woke before dawn to find that the landscape around Cedar Springs had been completely transformed. Where once there had been empty desert, there were now dozens of traditional Navajo dwellings and hundreds of horses and people. Cooking fires sent thin columns of smoke into the clear morning air, and the sounds of conversation and preparation created a festive atmosphere that was both exciting and overwhelming. The first day of the ceremony was devoted to introductions and preliminary rituals. Margaret and James were formally presented to the various chiefs and elders who had come to participate, each introduction requiring specific protocols and exchanges of greetings. Kay and Michael served as translators and guides, helping their adoptive parents navigate the complex social dynamics of the gathering. John Yazzie had arrived several days earlier with his wife, who had recovered sufficiently from her injuries to make the journey. This was the first time Margaret had met the children's birth mother, and the meeting was deeply emotional for both women. Despite the language barrier, they communicated their mutual respect and gratitude through gestures, expressions, and the universal language of mothers who had shared the care of beloved children. The second day featured formal presentations and storytelling, with various speakers describing the significance of the O'Brien family's actions and their importance to the broader Navajo community. Margaret was amazed to learn how their story had been interpreted, and what meanings different groups had found in it. Some saw it as an example of the possibility for justice and kindness in an often hostile world, while others viewed it as a model for how children could successfully navigate multiple cultural identities. The most significant moment came on the third day, when the actual adoption ceremony took place. Margaret and James were dressed in traditional Navajo clothing that had been specially made for the occasion, and they participated in rituals that formally welcomed them into the tribal family structure. The ceremony was conducted entirely in Navajo, but Thomas Begay provided whispered translations that helped them understand the profound commitments being made on both sides. The climax of the ceremony came when Margaret and James were presented with their Navajo names and officially recognized as mother and father within the tribal community. Margaret's name, which translated roughly to "she who brings children home," honored her rescue of Ke and Michael. James's name, "he who provides shelter," recognized his role in creating a safe and supportive environment for their recovery. The gifts presented during the ceremony were extraordinary in their beauty and significance. Margaret received jewelry and textiles that had been created specifically for the event by master craftspeople from throughout the region. James was presented with horses and riding equipment that marked his status as a respected member of the community. Most importantly, both received ceremonial items that would allow them to participate in future tribal gatherings and maintain their connections to the Navajo community. Ke and Michael played central roles in the ceremony, demonstrating their fluency in both languages and their comfort in both cultures. They spoke about their experiences, their gratitude to all the adults who had cared for them, and their excitement about their future as bridges between two worlds. Their poise and articulation impressed all the observers and provided powerful evidence of the success of their bicultural upbringing. The ceremony concluded with a feast that brought together hundreds of people in a celebration that lasted well into the night. Traditional Navajo foods were served alongside contributions from the Cedar Springs community, creating a fusion that symbolized the cultural bridge that had been built. Music and dancing continued for hours, with both traditional Navajo performances and contemporary songs that reflected the blending of cultures. The national media coverage of the ceremony was extensive and generally positive, portraying it as a hopeful example of intercultural understanding in a time when such cooperation was rare. Several magazines featured lengthy articles about the O'Brien family and their unique arrangement, and the story was cited in academic papers about progressive approaches to child welfare and cultural preservation. However, the most significant impact of the ceremony was not the public attention it generated, but the lasting relationships it created. Margaret and James found themselves connected to an extended network of Navajo families and communities that would remain important throughout their lives. They were invited to participate in other ceremonies and celebrations, and their advice was sought on matters related to intercultural education and adoption. The ceremony also established Kay and Michael as important figures within both communities. Their success in navigating two cultures made them natural intermediaries for other families facing similar challenges, and they began serving as translators and cultural advisors while still teenagers. Their story became an inspiration for other children dealing with questions of identity and belonging. In the years that followed the ceremony, the arrangement established between Margaret and James and John Yazzie continued to evolve and flourish. Kay and Michael spent summers with their birth family and the school year in Cedar Springs, becoming increasingly sophisticated in their understanding of both cultures. They excelled academically and went on to higher education, eventually becoming leaders in their own right in efforts to build bridges between communities. Margaret often reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that dust storm in 1923. What had begun as a simple act of compassion during a natural disaster had evolved into something that touched hundreds of lives and created lasting change in the relationships between different communities. The two children she had rescued had indeed become bridges between worlds, just as the ceremony had recognized. The ceremony of the 200 Braves became a legendary event in the history of the Southwest, remembered not just for its size and spectacle, but for what it represented about the possibility of understanding and cooperation between different peoples. It demonstrated that families could be created across cultural boundaries and that children could successfully maintain multiple identities when supported by loving adults who put their welfare first. Years later, when Kay and Michael had children of their own, they would tell the story of their rescue from the dust storm and the ceremony that honored their adoptive parents. The tale would be passed down through generations, serving as a reminder that love and family can transcend any boundary and that acts of kindness can create ripples that extend far beyond their original scope. Margaret's final journal entry about the ceremony, written weeks after the last visitors had departed and Cedar Springs had returned to its normal quiet rhythm, captured the essence of what had been accomplished. We thought we were simply caring for two lost children, but we discovered that in healing them, we had healed something in ourselves and in our community. The ceremony was not really about honoring us, but about celebrating the capacity of the human heart to expand beyond its original boundaries and create family where none existed before.